Hi, welcome to the Silent Avenger channel. If you're enjoying the content, please consider giving it a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into today's story. My name's Gary. I'm a cybersecurity consultant, and until a few months ago, I thought I had it all: a fulfilling career, a beautiful home, and a smart, ambitious wife named Chloe. She's a political consultant with a knack for making connections and solving complex problems. Together, we were a power couple, or so it seemed. But now I'm here, trying to make sense of the chaos my life has become. It started with little things most people would probably dismiss. Chloe began parking in the driveway in a rush, sometimes blocking me in. Her explanation was always something about being late for a meeting or forgetting to unload groceries. Then there were the notes. Small, cryptic messages scribbled on sticky pads, things like 3 p.m., Capital Grill, or discuss with N. I figured it was work-related. After all, politics is a messy, fast-paced game. But then there was her phone. Chloe had always been guarded about it, but lately, she'd started keeping it face down and clutching it tightly when I walked into the room. She'd say things like, "You wouldn't understand, it's just boring political stuff," if I asked. Something felt off. One night, I came home early from a client meeting to find Chloe in the kitchen, quickly shoving papers into her briefcase. I asked her about it, and she laughed nervously, saying, "Just a work thing. You wouldn't find it interesting." But when I glanced at one of the papers sticking out, it wasn't boring. It was a photocopy of a legislative proposal marked for review. Her job didn't typically involve reviewing legislative documents, at least not directly. That was the first time I felt the need to dig deeper. As a cybersecurity expert, I know how to investigate without leaving traces. I started with her schedule, cross-checking the notes she left around the house with a calendar on her work laptop, which she occasionally forgot to log out of. I noticed discrepancies, meetings with names that didn't match up, or locations far from her office. My first real break came when I found a text chain between Chloe and a number saved as N. Their messages were cryptic but intimate. It didn't take long to piece together that N was Nicholas, a senior aide for a prominent congressman. And then there was E. Through metadata on a few shared files Chloe accidentally left on our home network, I identified him as Eric, a well-known lobbyist. Both men had connections to some high-profile corruption cases in the news. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the thought of Chloe having an affair or the growing suspicion that she was involved in something far more sinister. That night, as Chloe slept, I made a decision. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. After that night, I couldn't look at Chloe the same way. Every time she smiled at me, I wondered if it was fake. Every kiss goodbye felt like a lie. But I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed more proof, and I had the skills to get it. I started by cloning her phone. It's not as hard as people think, especially when your spouse trusts you enough to leave it charging on the kitchen counter. Once I had access, I went through everything: texts, emails, even her browsing history. What I found made my stomach turn. There were texts between Chloe and Nicholas that went far beyond work. "Can't wait for our next meeting, and you make the worst days so much better," weren't the kind of messages you sent to a coworker. Then there were the photos, selfies of Chloe in her car, smiling in the parking lot of a hotel. The timestamps matched the days she told me she was working late. Nicholas had replied with messages like "perfect view to end the day" and "wish I could stay longer." But it wasn't just the affair. Mixed in with the flirtation were mentions of E and discussions about proposals and deliverables. Some of the attachments Chloe sent to Nicholas were labeled with things like "Draft, HR 312 policy changes." It was clear they weren't just discussing personal matters, they were orchestrating something shady, and it had to do with government policies. I needed to understand more. Through work, I had access to tools for tracking devices and monitoring communication patterns. I set up a program to ping Chloe's location every hour. Within a week, I saw a pattern. Chloe frequently visited an office building downtown that didn't match any of her claimed work locations. When I checked the building's tenants, one stood out: Capital Strategies, a lobbying firm where Eric was a partner. Now I had Nicholas and Eric tied to Chloe. I decided to take things further. Using my expertise, I accessed the public Wi-Fi network in the Capital Strategies building and set up a capture tool. I couldn't legally intercept private communications, but I could see which devices were active and how often Chloe's phone connected there. It confirmed my suspicions. Chloe had been there repeatedly, and for long periods. Then came the final piece of the puzzle. One night, Chloe left her work bag on the kitchen table and went to bed early, claiming she had a headache. Inside, I found a notebook. It was small, leather-bound, and looked innocuous at first glance. But when I opened it, I realized I'd struck gold. The pages were filled with shorthand notes, dates, and initials. Phrases like N/E discuss leverage, Q4 payouts, keep low profile, and graft list confirmed with E jumped out at me. I took photos of every page before carefully putting the notebook back. I didn't sleep that night. I stared at the photos, realizing my wife wasn't just cheating on me, she was involved in a conspiracy that could blow up in a major way. Bribery, forged documents, manipulated legislative outcomes, it was all there in black and white. Chloe wasn't just betraying me, she was betraying the very system she claimed to serve. I felt sick. Part of me wanted to throw the notebook in her face and demand answers. Another part of me realized this was bigger than our marriage. If I went to her now, she'd destroy the evidence or find a way to spin it. I couldn't let that happen. So, I did what I do best. I started compiling everything into a detailed file: texts, photos, notes, locations, and metadata. I encrypted it and made multiple backups. If Chloe thought she could hide this from me, she was wrong. I had all the pieces, the texts, the locations, the notebook, but I didn't know where to start. This wasn't just about Chloe anymore. Nicholas and Eric were big names in their circles, and if they were pulling strings like I suspected, this could shake up more than just my marriage. I needed someone who understood the stakes but wasn't tied to Chloe's world. That's when I thought of Hannah. Hannah was a federal ethics officer I'd met at a cybersecurity conference a couple of years ago. We'd hit it off professionally, trading war stories about bureaucracy and corruption. She'd mentioned how much she hated seeing people abuse their power, and something about her no-nonsense attitude stuck with me. If anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was her. I sent Hannah an encrypted email. It was short, just enough to get her attention. I need your expertise. It's about political corruption, serious stuff. Can we talk? Confidential. She responded within an hour. Gary, this better not be some techie prank. Call me on Signal. Here's my number. That night, I stepped out into the garage for privacy and dialed her. I gave her the basics, without naming names, and she didn't mince words. This isn't something you handle alone, she said firmly. If what you're saying is true, you're looking at a major scandal. Do you have evidence? I do, I said, my voice tight. Texts, locations, documents, even financial hints. She was quiet for a moment before saying, meet me tomorrow. Bring everything. This isn't a phone call conversation. We agreed on a cafe in a quiet part of town. When I arrived, Hannah was already there, her sharp suit making her stand out against the casual coffee shop crowd. She looked at me like she was sizing up whether I was worth her time. Let's see it, she said, wasting no time. I handed her a tablet loaded with the evidence. As she swiped through the files, her expression darkened. Jesus, Gary, she muttered. This isn't just corruption, it's treasonous. Legislative manipulation? Bribery? If this comes out, heads are going to roll. She leaned back, crossing her arms. Who's your wife tied up with? I hesitated. Nicholas and Eric, I said finally. Her eyes widened. Nicholas Grant and Eric Westfield? I nodded, and she let out a low whistle. They're practically untouchable. If they're involved, this goes deep. And if your wife is working with them, you're in dangerous territory. Hannah agreed to help, but she had conditions. We're not leaking this to the media. Not yet. This needs to go through the proper channels, or it'll blow up in our faces. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Hannah was in, but this was only the beginning. Hannah and I agreed that if we were going to take down Nicholas, Eric, and Chloe's operation, we needed someone on the inside. Someone with access to the people and places we couldn't reach. That's when she mentioned Lily. Lily was a junior staffer in a senator's office, someone Hannah had worked with on a few ethics reviews. She was sharp, ambitious, and idealistic, exactly the kind of person who would be disgusted by what was happening. But she was also young and inexperienced, and I worried about putting her in harm's way. She's already in that world, Hannah said. She just doesn't know how dirty it is yet. If we bring her in carefully, she could be our best shot at getting the proof we need. Hannah reached out to Lily, framing it as a general inquiry about unethical behavior in her office. They met for coffee, and by the time Hannah returned, she was convinced Lily could help. "She's already suspicious," Hannah told me. "She's seen some things, documents disappearing, meetings that don't add up. She just didn't know what to do about it. When I gave her a few hints, she jumped at the chance to dig deeper. Lily joined our effort cautiously, but once I showed her the evidence I'd collected, she was all in. This is worse than I thought," she said, flipping through screenshots of Chloe's texts and notes. "If Nicholas and Eric are involved, this isn't just political gamesmanship. They're rewriting laws for personal gain." Lily's position gave her access to meetings and memos that filled in the gaps in our timeline. She started feeding us information, anonymously at first, about how Nicholas and Eric were leveraging their connections. They'd bribed lawmakers, suppressed opposition, and funneled money through dummy organizations to hide their tracks. One day, Lily called me, her voice trembling. "Gary, they know something's up. Nicholas was yelling in his office today, saying someone's been leaking information. He mentioned Chloe." I felt my stomach twist. Chloe wasn't just a cog in their machine, she was a liability now. And if Nicholas thought she was the leak, things could get dangerous fast. "We need to act," Hannah said when I told her. "They're getting paranoid. If we wait too long, they'll start covering their tracks, and all of this will be for nothing." That night, I sat in my office, staring at the files on my computer. I thought about Chloe, the woman I'd fallen in love with, who'd stood beside me at our wedding, who'd helped me decorate our first home. How had we gotten here? But then I thought about the notebook, the texts, and the lies. Chloe hadn't just betrayed me, she'd betrayed everyone who believed in her. It was time to take the next step. With Nicholas and Eric getting paranoid, Hannah decided it was time to escalate. "We need to take this higher," she said, her tone serious. "We have enough to draw attention, but we need someone with authority to act. Someone who can't be easily bought off or intimidated." She suggested involving a federal oversight committee. It wasn't an easy call. If we brought the wrong person into the fold, the whole operation could leak, and Chloe and her associates would cover their tracks before we could stop them. "I know someone," Hannah finally said. "He's clean and hates corruption as much as I do. His name's Agent Cross. He works with the Office of Government Ethics. If anyone can help us take this public without tipping them off, it's him." Agent Cross wasn't what I expected. He was younger, sharper, and more intense than the stereotypical bureaucrat I'd imagined. When we met at a discreet location, a rented office space Hannah had secured, he didn't waste time with small talk. "Let me see what you've got," Cross said. I laid everything out for him, copies of the texts, Chloe's notebook, location logs, and the memos Lily had provided. As he went through the evidence, his expression darkened. "This is serious," he said. "You're implicating high-ranking officials, a lobbyist with deep ties, and a sitting member of Congress. If this gets out, it's not just their careers on the line, it's potential jail time." "That's the idea," I said, trying to sound confident. Cross nodded but looked wary. "We'll need to move quickly. If they catch wind of this, they'll lawyer up and bury everything." "Do you have more evidence on Chloe's role specifically?" I hesitated. "Not yet. But I can get it." Hannah cut in. "Gary, are you sure? If Chloe realizes what you're doing." "She won't," I said firmly, though my chest tightened at the thought. "I'll get what we need." That night, I went home knowing what I had to do. Chloe was already asleep, so I crept into her home office and booted up her laptop. I'd cloned her phone, but I needed access to her work files, emails, attachments, anything that tied her directly to the corruption. It didn't take long to find something damning. In her email drafts was a message addressed to Nicholas and Eric. Revised allocation figures attached. "Let me know if the senator needs additional incentive. I'll handle it." The attachment was a spreadsheet detailing payouts to various officials, with cryptic notes about services rendered and advocacy bonuses. My hands trembled as I took screenshots and copied the files to a secure drive. This was it, the smoking gun. The next morning, I sent the files to Cross through a secure channel. When he called later that day, his voice was grim. "This is more than enough. We're moving forward." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means a subpoena is being prepared," he said. "And Chloe is about to have the worst day of her life." The day the subpoena was served was the day my life, and Chloe's, changed forever. It was a typical morning, or at least, Chloe thought it was. She left for work in her usual hurry, her coffee barely touched, and her briefcase in hand. I watched her drive off, my heart pounding. She had no idea what was coming. Around noon, I got a call from Agent Cross. "It's done," he said simply. "She's been served. Nicholas and Eric too." I didn't know what to feel. Relief? Guilt? Anger? A mix of all three, maybe. Cross assured me that Chloe was being summoned for questioning about her involvement with Nicholas and Eric's operation, but I couldn't stop picturing her reaction when the documents landed in her hands. That evening, Chloe came home visibly shaken. She slammed the door and threw her briefcase onto the couch. "Gary," she called, her voice sharp. "We need to talk." I braced myself and walked into the living room. She looked furious and scared, a combination I'd never seen before. "Do you know anything about this?" she demanded, waving the subpoena in my face. "What is it?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "Don't play dumb," she snapped. "This is about Nicholas and Eric. They're accusing me of corruption. Bribery, forgery. Gary, this could ruin my career." Her words stung, but not in the way she expected. I could feel the weight of my own betrayal pressing down on me, but I kept my expression neutral. "Why would they accuse you of something like that?" I asked carefully. She hesitated, her eyes darting away. "I don't know. Maybe they're trying to cover their tracks. They're dragging me into it to save themselves." I knew she was lying, but I didn't let it show. "Do you need a lawyer?" I asked. "Yes," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I need to call someone. We have to fight this." I nodded, excusing myself to the kitchen under the pretense of giving her space. In reality, I needed to catch my breath. Watching her panic, knowing the truth, was harder than I thought it would be. Over the next few days, things spiraled. Chloe's name started popping up in the news. At first, it was vague, mentions of a political consultant under investigation, but it didn't take long for reporters to connect the dots. By the end of the week, Chloe's photo was plastered across every major outlet, her connection to Nicholas and Eric front and center. The house felt like a war zone. Chloe barely spoke to me, spending her days on the phone with lawyers and colleagues. When she did talk, it was to vent her frustration. "They're framing me, Gary. They're making me the scapegoat." I didn't argue. What could I say? I wanted to believe she'd admit the truth, that she'd own up to what she'd done. But every word out of her mouth was a deflection, a denial. Then came the breaking point. One evening, Chloe got a call. I couldn't hear the details, but her face went pale as she listened. When she hung up, she turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "They're calling me to testify," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Under oath." My stomach dropped. If Chloe testified, everything could come out, not just her role in the corruption, but the affair, the lies, everything. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "I don't know," she said, sinking onto the couch. "If I tell the truth, I'm finished. But if I lie..." She didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what she meant. Lying under oath wasn't just risky, it was a guaranteed disaster. Chloe's anxiety grew in the days leading up to her testimony. She barely slept, pacing the house at all hours. Whenever I tried to talk to her, she'd either snap at me or retreat into her office. It was like living with a stranger, a far cry from the confident, poised woman I married. Meanwhile, Agent Cross and Hannah kept me updated. "Nicholas and Eric are circling the wagons," Cross said during one of our calls. "They're throwing resources into discrediting the investigation. Chloe might try to play the victim, but their strategy depends on keeping her quiet." "She won't admit anything unless her back's against the wall," I said. Cross paused. "And if she does?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to think about what would happen if Chloe told the truth, how it would reflect on me, on everything we built. The day of the testimony finally arrived. Chloe left the house early, dressed in a sharp navy suit that couldn't hide the tension in her shoulders. I watched her drive away, torn between wanting her to confess and hoping she'd somehow come out unscathed. Hannah and I met at her office to monitor the proceedings. The hearing wasn't televised, but transcripts and updates would be released quickly. Lily, our insider, had managed to secure access to a live feed, giving us a front-row seat to Chloe's moment of truth. As Chloe was sworn in, I barely recognized her. She looked confident, composed, but I could see the cracks beneath the surface. The questioning started with basic background details: her role, her work history, her connection to Nicholas and Eric. Chloe handled those easily, her answers rehearsed and polished. But then the committee chair leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "Mrs. Lambert, let's discuss the allocation figures you sent to Mr. Grant and Mr. Westfield. Were you aware these payments were intended to influence legislative decisions?" Chloe hesitated, her eyes flicking toward her lawyer. "I was following instructions," she said carefully. "My role was administrative. I wasn't privy to the details of how those figures were used." It was a calculated answer, designed to protect her while shifting the blame upward. For a moment, I thought she might get away with it. But the chair wasn't satisfied. He slid a document across the table, a copy of the email I'd found in her drafts. "Can you explain this, then? Specifically, the phrase additional incentive?" Chloe froze. I could almost feel her panic through the screen. She stammered something about context, but the damage was done. The committee pressed harder, bringing up the other evidence: the meetings, the payments, the connections to Nicholas and Eric's lobbying firm. The session stretched into the afternoon, and by the end, Chloe looked shattered. She hadn't fully confessed, but she hadn't cleared her name, either. As she stepped down from the stand, her lawyer whispered something to her, and she nodded numbly. Hannah let out a low whistle. "She's toast," she said. "The committee's got enough to keep digging. It's only a matter of time before they tie her to the bigger scheme." When Chloe came home that evening, she didn't say a word. She walked past me and went straight to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. I followed, unsure of what I'd say but knowing we couldn't keep avoiding the elephant in the room. When I opened the door, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. "Chloe," I said softly, "what happens now?" She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "I don't know," she whispered. "I think I just destroyed my career." I sat down beside her, the weight of everything pressing down on me. "Is there anything you want to tell me?" For a moment, I thought she might finally come clean. But then she shook her head. "It's complicated, Gary. You wouldn't understand." Her words stung, but I let them pass. I wasn't ready to reveal what I knew, not yet. The days following Chloe's testimony were a whirlwind. The media caught wind of her connection to Nicholas and Eric, and her name was dragged through every major outlet. Pundits speculated about her role, some defending her as a scapegoat, others painting her as a key player in the corruption scandal. At home, Chloe was a wreck. She spent hours on the phone with her lawyers, pacing the house and snapping at anyone who tried to talk to her. I kept my distance, unsure of what to say or do. Part of me wanted to confront her with everything I knew, but another part, maybe the part that still loved her, hesitated. Meanwhile, Hannah and Agent Cross were working overtime. "The committee is leaning on Nicholas and Eric now," Cross told me during one of our calls. "They're scrambling to cut deals, but if we can tie their actions directly to legislative changes, it'll seal their fate." Lily, our insider, continued to feed us information. She managed to retrieve a series of emails between Nicholas and a senator's office that detailed specific votes being influenced by financial contributions. It was the smoking gun we needed. "This is it," Hannah said, showing me the emails. "With this, they can't spin their way out of it. But it also means Chloe's deeper in than we thought." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "Some of these payments were coordinated directly through her," Hannah said. "She wasn't just following orders, she was actively involved." Hearing that confirmed what I'd been dreading. Chloe wasn't just a pawn, she was complicit. The breaking point came one evening when I overheard Chloe on the phone. Her voice was low and frantic, filled with desperation. "You promised this wouldn't come back to me," she hissed. "I did everything you asked. Why am I the one taking the fall?" There was a pause, and then she said, "No, I won't testify against you. Do you have any idea what they'll do to me if I flip?" She hung up, slamming her phone onto the table. I stepped into the room, and she jumped, clearly startled. "Who was that?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "None of your business," she snapped. "Is it Nicholas?" I pressed. "Or Eric?" Her face paled, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then she sighed heavily and said, "It's not what you think, Gary. I'm trying to fix this." "By protecting them?" I shot back. "You're not fixing anything, you're digging yourself deeper." She looked at me with a mixture of anger and despair. "You don't understand. If I flip on them, they'll destroy me. They're already destroying you, I said. And if you keep protecting them, you'll go down with them. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't sit by and watch Chloe sacrifice herself for Nicholas and Eric's sake. She might hate me for it, but I wasn't going to let her go down without a fight. I called Hannah and Cross and told them everything. Chloe's call, her reluctance to testify, her role in coordinating payments. She won't cooperate willingly, I said. But if you push her, she might crack. Cross was blunt. This won't be easy, Gary. She'll see it as a betrayal. I know, I said. But it's the only way to save her from herself. The day after my call with Cross, the committee subpoenaed Chloe again, this time with more pointed questions about her coordination with Nicholas and Eric. She was livid when she got the notice, pacing the kitchen and muttering under her breath. They're trying to pin everything on me, she said, throwing the paper onto the counter. I don't know how they're getting this information. I stayed quiet, unsure how much to say. But I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that the walls were closing in on her, and I was one of the people pushing them. When Chloe returned from her second testimony, she looked exhausted. They know too much, she admitted, collapsing onto the couch. They even brought up the payouts, specific amounts, dates, everything. I don't know how they got that. I sat beside her, trying to sound neutral. What are you going to do? She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, Nicholas told me to keep denying everything. But I don't know if I can. They're threatening jail time, Gary. This was my chance. Maybe it's time to think about yourself, I said carefully. If you testify honestly, you could cut a deal, avoid the worst of it. She looked at me, her expression a mix of suspicion and desperation. You think I should flip on them? I nodded. You don't owe them anything, Chloe. They'd throw you under the bus in a heartbeat. Over the next few days, Chloe grew quieter, spending hours locked in her office. I could tell she was weighing her options, and it was tearing her apart. Meanwhile, Cross confirmed that the evidence was mounting against Nicholas and Eric, thanks to Lily's continued efforts. She's the linchpin, Cross told me. If Chloe testifies against them, this whole operation collapses. I just hoped Chloe would see it the same way. The night before her next hearing, Chloe sat across from me at the dinner table, her untouched plate between us. Her eyes were hollow, her confidence completely eroded. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. If I testify against them, they'll come after me. If I don't, I could go to jail. I leaned forward, choosing my words carefully. If you don't tell the truth, you're carrying this alone. Nicholas and Eric will throw you under the bus without a second thought. Testifying doesn't make you weak, it makes you smart. She didn't reply, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. I wanted to believe she was weighing the right choice, but I knew how deeply tied she was to them. The next morning, Chloe left early for the hearing. I didn't go to work, I couldn't. Instead, I sat at home pacing, checking my phone every 5 minutes for updates. Around noon, Hannah called. She cracked, she said, her voice a mix of relief and caution. Chloe testified against Nicholas and Eric. She detailed how the payments were funneled, how decisions were influenced. She didn't hold back. I sank into the couch, feeling equal parts relief and dread. Chloe had done the right thing, but I knew it would come at a cost, professionally, personally, and for our marriage. When Chloe came home that evening, she looked like a shell of herself. She set her purse down and stood in the doorway, staring at me. I told them everything, she said flatly. I nodded. You did the right thing. She shook her head, a bitter smile on her lips. The right thing? Gary, my career is over. My reputation is ruined. Nicholas and Eric will never forgive me. Maybe, I said. But at least you're not carrying their guilt anymore. For the first time in weeks, she didn't argue. Instead, she sat down beside me and buried her face in her hands. The day after Chloe's testimony, the news broke. Headlines plastered her name alongside Nicholas and Eric's, describing her as the whistleblower who had exposed their corruption. While the media was quick to label her a hero, not everyone saw it that way. The backlash was immediate. Chloe's former colleagues distanced themselves, issuing carefully worded statements about how they were shocked and saddened by the revelations. On social media, people either praised her courage or called her a traitor. At home, things were tense. Chloe barely left the bedroom, avoiding calls and messages. I tried to check on her, but she shut me out. I don't want to talk about it, she said when I knocked on the door. Chloe, you did the right thing, I insisted. She looked at me, her eyes red from crying. Did I? Because it doesn't feel like it. Everyone hates me, Gary. Everyone. Meanwhile, Nicholas and Eric weren't going down quietly. Their legal teams issued statements claiming Chloe's testimony was a fabrication, a desperate attempt to save herself. They painted her as the mastermind, accusing her of orchestrating the payouts and manipulating the system for her own benefit. They're going to bury me, Chloe said when the news broke. They're trying, I admitted. But the evidence is against them, not you. The committee has everything they need. Because of you, she said bitterly, her tone sharp. Her words hit like a slap, and I froze. Did she know I'd been involved in gathering the evidence? What are you talking about? I asked carefully. She shook her head and turned away. Nothing. Forget it. The tension between us grew thicker by the day. Chloe's resentment was palpable, and I couldn't tell if it was directed at me, herself, or the situation. Gary, do you still love me? She asked one night, her voice barely audible. The question caught me off guard. I thought about everything, the lies, the betrayal, the chaos she'd brought into our lives. I don't know, I said honestly. Her expression crumpled, but she nodded. That's fair. After Chloe's testimony, things at home felt hollow. We lived under the same roof, but it was like being strangers. Every conversation was strained, every glance heavy with unspoken words. Chloe spent most of her time in the bedroom or pacing the house with her phone pressed to her ear. The calls were usually with her lawyer or reporters asking for comments. She turned down every interview request, and I couldn't tell if it was out of guilt, fear, or exhaustion. One evening, I decided to break the silence. She was sitting at the dining table, scrolling through her phone, and I sat down across from her. We can't keep living like this, I said. She didn't look up. What do you want me to say, Gary? That I'm sorry? That I regret everything? Do you? Her hand paused mid-scroll, and she set the phone down. I regret what it's done to us, she said slowly. But I don't regret what I did for my career. At least, not until now. I leaned back, the weight of her words settling on me. You don't regret working with them? I regret trusting them, she admitted. But at the time, I thought I was doing what I had to. You've never been in my position. You don't know how cutthroat it is. That doesn't justify it, Chloe, I said. You weren't just playing politics. You were breaking laws. She looked away, her jaw tightening. And I'll pay for it. I already am. Later that night, I got a call from Hannah. Nicholas and Eric are starting to fold, she said. The committee's putting pressure on them, and they're turning on each other. Chloe's testimony was the tipping point. It should have been good news, but it didn't feel like it. While Nicholas and Eric's empire crumbled, my marriage felt irreparable. She's angry at me, I admitted. I think she knows I had something to do with this. Maybe you should tell her the truth, Hannah suggested. I don't think she can handle it, I said. Not right now. The next morning, Chloe surprised me by coming downstairs dressed for the first time in days. I'm going out, she said, grabbing her keys. Where? To think, she replied curtly. She didn't come back until late that night. I didn't ask where she'd been, and she didn't volunteer the information. Chloe's late-night outings became a regular thing. She'd leave without saying much and return hours later, her face unreadable. I stopped asking where she was going. It didn't seem to matter anymore. The distance between us had grown into a chasm, and I wasn't sure if it could be bridged. One evening, she came home earlier than usual and found me in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. Without a word, she sat down beside me, closer than she had in weeks. We need to talk, she said, her voice calm but heavy. I muted the TV and turned to her. I'm listening. She hesitated, then said, I've been thinking about everything, the lies, the choices I made, what I put you through. I know I've destroyed us, Gary. And I'm not sure if there's a way to fix it. Her honesty caught me off guard. For so long, she'd been defensive, deflecting blame. But now, there was a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I don't know if we can fix this either, I admitted. You broke my trust, Chloe. And it's not just the affair or the corruption, it's everything. I don't even know who you are anymore. Her eyes welled up, and for a moment, I thought she might break down. But she held it together. I don't know who I am either, she said softly. I've spent so long chasing success, trying to stay ahead, that I lost sight of what really matters. And now, I've lost you too. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, I spoke. Do you want to fix this? Do you even want us to work? She nodded slowly. I do. But I don't know if I deserve it. That's not for me to decide, I said. But if we're going to try, it has to start with honesty. No more secrets. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. There's something I need to ask you, she said. And I need the truth too. Okay. Were you involved in any of this? Did you help them build the case against me? My heart raced. I thought about lying, about deflecting, but I couldn't. Not if there was any hope of salvaging what we had. Yes, I said quietly. I found evidence, your emails, your notes. I gave it to the investigators. She stared at me, her face a mix of betrayal and resignation. I thought so, she said after a long pause. I guess I can't blame you. I gave you every reason to doubt me. I didn't want to hurt you, I said. But I couldn't let you keep going down that path. She nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. Thank you for being honest. I guess that's the first step. After our conversation, Chloe and I settled into an uneasy truce. We weren't fighting, but we weren't exactly reconnecting either. The truth was out in the open now, my role in exposing her and her acknowledgement of what she'd done. But knowing the truth didn't make it easier to live with. For a few days, we tiptoed around each other, careful not to spark another confrontation. Chloe spent most of her time on the phone with her lawyers, while I threw myself into work, grateful for the distraction. Still, I couldn't ignore the elephant in the room. One evening, after dinner, Chloe sat down across from me at the dining table. Her posture was stiff, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I've been thinking, she said, her voice hesitant, about us. I set my coffee down, bracing myself. And I don't know if we can fix this, she admitted. But I want to try. Her words surprised me. Why now? Because despite everything, you stood by me when it mattered, she said. Even when you had every reason to walk away, you didn't. And I don't want to give up on us if there's still a chance. I let out a slow breath. Chloe, trying means more than words. It means rebuilding trust, and that's going to take time, if it's even possible. She nodded, her expression earnest. I know. I just need to know if you're willing to try too. I thought about everything we'd been through, the lies, the betrayal, the hurt. Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave the pain behind and start fresh. But another part of me still cared, still hoped. I'm willing to try, I said finally. But it's going to be hard, Chloe. We can't go back to the way things were. I don't want to go back, she said softly. I want us to be better. Over the next few weeks, we started taking small steps toward rebuilding. Chloe began seeing a therapist to process her choices and the fallout from her actions. I started therapy too, trying to untangle the knot of anger and hurt I'd been carrying. We also began having honest conversations about her involvement with Nicholas and Eric, about the affair, about the choices we'd both made that led us here. It wasn't easy. There were tears, arguments, and moments when it felt like we were making no progress at all. One night, as we sat on the couch after another tense conversation, Chloe reached for my hand. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back, she said. But I need you to know that I'm committed to making this right, whatever it takes. Her words felt sincere, but they didn't erase the pain. I want to believe you, I said. But it's going to take time. I understand, she said, squeezing my hand. In the background, the fallout from the scandal continued to unfold. Nicholas and Eric were indicted on charges of bribery, conspiracy, and fraud, thanks in large part to Chloe's testimony. The media painted her as both a whistleblower and an accomplice, and public opinion was sharply divided. One evening, we watched the news together as a reporter detailed the latest developments. When they showed a clip of Chloe leaving the hearing, I glanced at her. Do you regret testifying? I asked. She shook her head. No. It was the right thing to do, even if it ruined me. Do you think we can move forward? I pressed. She met my eyes, her gaze steady. I don't know. But I want to try. It's been a few months since everything came crashing down. I'd love to say things are perfect now, but that wouldn't be true. What I can say is that we're still here trying. And maybe that's enough for now. Chloe lost her job, as we both knew she would. With Nicholas and Eric's indictment, The fallout extended to everyone connected to them. Some of her former colleagues publicly distanced themselves, others reached out quietly, offering support or understanding. Still, the damage to her reputation was irreversible. "I have to start over," she told me one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun set. "Not just professionally, but as a person. I need to figure out who I am without all this." She gestured vaguely, as if pointing at the wreckage of her past life. I nodded. "Starting over isn't a bad thing," I said. "But it's going to take work." She looked at me, her expression serious. "I'm willing to do the work, Gary. For myself, and for us. We've been rebuilding slowly." Chloe's therapy sessions have helped her come to terms with her choices and the harm she caused, not just to me, but to others. I'm in therapy too, trying to unpack the anger, betrayal, and loss I've been carrying. One of the hardest parts has been redefining what our relationship looks like. The trust isn't fully there yet, and maybe it never will be. But we've learned how to communicate in ways we never did before. Nicholas and Eric's trial is set for later this year. Chloe is expected to testify again, this time as a key witness. She's nervous about it, but she knows it's necessary. "I never thought my life would end up here," she said the other night, as we sat together on the couch. "But maybe it's a chance to make things right." "Maybe it is," I replied. "As for me, I've learned a lot through all of this. I've learned that love isn't always enough to fix what's broken, but it can be a reason to try. I've learned that forgiveness isn't a one-time act, it's a process, one I'm still navigating. And I've learned that sometimes, the person you love the most can hurt you the worst, and still be worth fighting for. So where do we go from here? I don't have all the answers, but I know this: we're moving forward. Slowly, cautiously, but together. Thanks to everyone who followed my story, offered advice, and shared their own experiences. Your words have meant more than I can say. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that life doesn't follow a script, and sometimes, all you can do is take the next step, whatever that looks like.